previous guest. First question.
All right. What was a defining moment in your career?
Retiring.
Surely that was a defining moment. I mean, I think, so I started out my Navy career as a surface warfare officer, and a lot of uncertainty in that because my goal the whole time was to go to BUD/S and be a SEAL. And so you kind of jump into this community that, you know, I didn't necessarily want to be a part of, but I needed to succeed in order to get where I wanted to go. And so I spent about 2.5, not quite 2.5 years on the ship. And eventually I went through 2 what are called lateral transfer boards where you basically apply. There's a PT, there's interviews, there's med screening, all that stuff. And you apply kind of like you're applying to college. The board at the time, it's different now, but at the time the board met twice a year. So every 6 months, you know, they'd take their applications and make a decision. So the first one I applied to, I wasn't selected. And then the second one, which was really, I mean, that was it. If I wasn't going to make that one, it probably wasn't going to happen. And then I came into work one day, the ship was in port, and, you know, it's like 6:30 in the morning in the middle of February in Everett, Washington. So it's gray, and it's going to be gray all day. And I come in and I put my backpack down, and my buddy, who was always in early checking the message traffic on the ship, he comes in, he had printed out the message that had my orders to BUD/S. And he's like, "Hey man, congrats." And I went, "What's that?" And I looked at it. And the thing that was, I think, most shocking was I remember the date. February 24th was when the message came in, and it said detach no later than February of 2006. I was like, that's 4 days from now. So of course I took that message and went running down to the XO and, you know, the admin folks, and I was like, I'm leaving. And they're like, there's no way you can leave this ship in 4 days. I said, oh, there's a way, and we're going to find it. So that was a pretty defining moment for me. And I left February 28th. I left the ship and headed down to San Diego to start training. So yeah, I was the ends were frayed at that point. Because the way it works in the surface community is, you know, they set your orders, your next set of orders, about 6 months out. And the detailer, which is the guy who, you know, you're assigned to, and the surface community is large enough that there's a lot of these guys. And so the guy I was assigned to, I had been in contact with, and he's like, yeah, I know what you want to do, you know, but you need to have orders because you can't just sit on the ship without a next set of orders. So what we'll end up doing is just giving you what's called a hot fill billet, which is typically not a desirable position, usually on a staff somewhere. Not a great, I mean, even if I wanted to have a career in the surface community, it's typically not a great career option, whatever's available. And I kept looking, and the hot fill list changes all the time. And I kept logging onto the Buper's website, looking at the hot fills, and none of them were exciting. And I was just like, oh God, here it is. So I'd really kind of put all my chips in. And when those orders came through, I was pretty excited. It was a defining moment for sure.
In doing a little bit of background research on you, the assigned to Everett, Washington explains the Seattle Mariners fan.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. So April of '89, which was when they signed Ken Griffey Jr., is when I became a Seattle Mariners fan.
Oh, so it was just happenstance that you also ended up in a station in Washington.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was choice. I had actually, my middle school years, I lived in San Diego. My father had been located there to take over an aerospace engineering manufacturing plant. And the plant that they assigned him to shut down. They shut down the plant after a year, which really was kind of a dark time for my dad, but he went up to Washington and started working at a sort of a satellite aerospace company near Boeing. And he had that job so that would have been, I guess, before my 7th grade year. And my sister was in high school, and the decision my parents made at the time was, well, hey, I'll just, my dad will stay up in Washington. I'll finish out middle school. My sister will finish out high school. And then when she goes to college and I go to high school, we'll move to Seattle and live there. So my mom and I would travel maybe once a month or every 2 months or so up to see him. We'd catch a Mariners game. And I fell in love with the Northwest. And I was really excited to leave San Diego and go to see. I had school picked out that I was going to go to. And we even had a house picked out. We had all of it lined up. And then I think, if I remember right, it was right kind of at the end of 8th grade. We were going to move in about 3 months, maybe. And my dad got offered a job in Connecticut that he liked a lot more. And he's like, well, we're moving to Connecticut. And I was like, what? I don't even know what state's border Connecticut. Where's Connecticut? So we moved to Connecticut instead. So I never got to move to Washington, which broke my heart. But fast forward, 4 years of high school, I went to college for a year and then went to the Naval Academy. So 5 years later, after that, almost a decade later, I wanted to be a SEAL coming out of the Naval Academy. I didn't get a billet. It was a really competitive billet to get. There were 16 in my class, which actually ended up being 14 for a bizarre reason. One of us was already a SEAL. I think he was the last prior enlisted SEAL to go to the Naval Academy. I don't think they've had one since. So he took a billet. And then there was another guy who actually never commissioned who took a billet. He graduated but never commissioned. There was some physical thing. So that was really 14 guys. So it was super competitive in my class. And so I took the kind of the second choice that a lot of guys do if they really want to go become a SEAL eventually. The plan is typically go be a surface warfare officer, because it's the one community that you can really qualify in fairly quickly and transfer from. Pilots, it's a long qualification process, and then they commit you for a long time, so you really can't. The subs, too much goes into nuclear power training. So surface is really the way to do it. So it was ship selection night, and I'm picking my ship, and I had, like 5 ships that I had researched, and these are my best chances to transfer from and all that. And in hindsight, I had no idea what I was doing. I was better off doing it the way it ended up happening.
Just stick your hand in a bag,
which is exactly what happened. And so, all the ships that I thought I wanted to go to, they were all picked before I got a chance to. And I remember standing in line, and a classmate of mine was in front of me, and there was one set of orders left to the ship that I had sort of set myself on, which I think was in Hawaii. And the ship selection night, it's like I don't know if I can really compare it to the NFL draft, but it's kind of done that way. It's this sort of big ceremonial thing. And it was fun. And they had some very high-ranking folks there. I want to say
I laugh only because I really hope that it's not like the NFL, that the worst ship picks first.
No, it doesn't work. No, the midshipman pick, I don't know. It's probably nothing like the NFL draft, but as far as the ceremony goes, I suppose. And I think I was talking to the commander of the Pacific Fleet, was standing there. I think it was him. And he's like, "Oh, well, son, where are you headed? What do you want to do?" And I said, and as he was asking me this, the ship that I was going to take, the last set of orders got picked. And I was like, it was like shaking his hand. I'm like, that one. And he looks at me and goes, "Well, better make a snap decision." And I said, "You know what, sir? I think I'm going to go to Everett, Washington." Because there were 2 spots sitting there. And I was like, Washington. Oh, yeah. I used to like that place. So, and he looked at me and he said, "I'll tell you what, best kept secret in the fleet." And I said, "I believe you." So I picked the ship, went to Washington, a few months later after I graduated, and truthfully, it was probably one of the best decisions I ever made. I loved it there. Did a lot of mountain biking, there's just so much opportunity if you're an outdoors inclined person, to get out there and really just explore. And I loved it. I loved it. And the ship was fine. I'm not sure I loved every aspect of being on the ship, but it eventually grew on me, and I enjoyed the job that I was in. I was an engineer, which was not something I expected to like.
That was what I was going to ask you next is, are you simply picking the ship and then as a junior officer, when you get there, they slot you where they need you?
Yeah, you don't really have, well, I don't know what it's like now, but this is about 20 years ago. We were actually the first class, so normally the process was you graduate from school and you would go to what's called Surface Warfare Officer School, which was in Newport, Rhode Island. It was about a 6-month school. And then they'd send you out to your ship. And my class was the first one where they got rid of that process and they just sent you straight to the ship. And this was, spring of 2003. The invasion had just started. A lot of ships were deployed for a long time. I think the one that I went to had been on deployment. I think in total they did about a 10-month deployment, and I caught the last 6.
Hey, real quick. Let's talk surfing and bourbon. The Pendleton Surf Club's all-military surf contest is happening October 9th through the 12th at Church Surf Break on Camp Pendleton. Whether you ride a longboard or a shortboard, if you're active duty, a veteran, or a military spouse, this is your chance to paddle out, compete, and connect. It's 4 days of nonstop action, pro-level judging, raffles, giveaways, and shared stoke with your crew on the sand. Your registration includes meals, contest swag, and the chance to take home the trophy. Spots are limited, and registration closes October 1st. So secure your place now at PendletonSurfClub.com. And for those whose ears perked up when I said bourbon, Pendleton Surf Club has released Board Shack Bourbon, crafted to celebrate the stories, the service, and the surf. Every penny from every bottle sold funds the event and supports the surfers. So even if you don't surf, you can support the event and enjoy some good bourbon. Grab your board, get your bottle, and help give back to military members and veterans. Go check out PendletonSurfClub.com.
So I actually flew out to Bahrain and then down to the UAE, and then the helicopter came and picked me up, and I arrived in the middle of the Persian Gulf, or I guess it was the Gulf of Oman, on this ship that I had never set foot on before. I'd never set foot on a surface ship in my entire life, ever. Not even on a midshipman cruise or anything. Nothing.
Did you even know if you'd get seasick?
Oh, I'd been seasick before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that no problem, because there's a cruise that you do as a midshipman. It's called a YP cruise, and you're on about 100-foot long. I think the boats they use used to be minesweepers, the little tiny things. And crossing the Delaware Bay, I just lost it. And so I got the sea legs early, and I never had a problem on the ship. We went through a couple storms and it was a little rough, but I was good. Iron stomach. But it was definitely culture shock. It set home, like, okay, I'm here now, and I gotta figure this out because I still know where I want to go. And you just you get the sense that you're at the base of the mountain. And for me, the peak was just getting those orders to go to Buds, which was really a false summit, right? And it's a lot of peaks after that.
I mean, in mountain climbing terms, that's maybe base camp,
It's like you flew into Karachi, and K2 is like 4 years from now. So I started there, and you really, as soon as I showed up, they're like, okay, and because of the absence of surface warfare officer school, I was showing up to the ship at the same time the guys who were a year ahead of me were showing up to the ship. So we had double the number of people. It was a ship that was built for, I think it was supposed to have a complement of about 16 officers. We had 40, including our aviators. So,
in the scheme of things, when you say you're showing up with other new officers, but who have already had a year at surface warfare school, is it then magnifying it? So though you're only a year apart, I would imagine it's got to be like you're 3 or 5 years apart in just general knowledge of the ship. And
maybe I think the reason why they did away with what's called SWAS, I think the reason why they did away with it because they were like, these guys aren't really learning that much. They would learn a lot more if they just went out to their ship and started getting their hands dirty and doing the job. So I get to the ship, and I was initially assigned in the combat systems department, and all I was doing was, I mean, you can imagine, I know nothing. I can barely tell the pointy end from from the flat end, and my job was to route these what are called casualty reports, CAS reps, for a piece of equipment that would break constantly. I don't know that it ever functioned. And so my job was to run around the ship, and this document that I had never seen, I had no idea if what was written was correct or anything. And I had to run around the ship getting everyone's signature for routing, and then eventually to the commanding officer so the message could go out. And that was my job. I just ran around the ship getting people's signatures for a couple months, and that wasn't very fulfilling. When I came back from that deployment, they reassigned me down to the engineering department, which initially I was like, ugh. I just started to barely scratch the surface and getting to know the combat systems department. And then they moved me down to engineering, and I'm like, oh God, the one place I never wanted to be. But you know, the guys, I liked the guys. They were kind of rough around the edges kind of guys. They like to hunt. They like to fish. They chewed tobacco. They had no qualms. I mean, it was nice if they called me sir. They never did. It was fine. Like they just, and you know, it's hard to compare those guys with team guys, but they were sort of a similar mentality. They had a healthy disdain for authority. They liked to work. You know, we were a gas turbine engine. They were gas turbine mechanics. And they were fun, you know, they were punchy, and I kind of enjoyed that. And then when I eventually qualified in the plant, I really enjoyed the watch that I was assigned to, which was running the plant, which was essentially casualty control. I was there for contingencies, and which, you know, the procedural kind of method to go through solving those problems really appealed to me. And I didn't know it would. This kind of surprised me about myself. But I've often kind of reflected on the similarity between that kind of being the casualty control sort of, you know, you get this alarm, you do this action, you know, you communicate, you do all these things. Very similar, weirdly, to managing contingencies on a target. And I didn't realize that either until I had to do that. And then I thought to myself, you know what this is kind of like? It's almost like standing an engineering watch. This happens, you have this procedure, you need to communicate with these people, you've got folks who are able to solve problems for you. I mean, it was honestly, when you boil it down, it was very similar problem solving with obvious differences. But I enjoyed that ultimately. And I was fortunate, you know, I didn't really love everything about the ship or the community, but I have to be thankful that, you know, I had a couple commanding officers who supported me. They knew what I wanted to do, and they made it possible. And so I have a hard time speaking poorly about that community. They got me to where I wanted to go. So I'm grateful for that.
This might come across as a rhetorical question. Having been able to spend that little bit of time in a leadership position at what I would refer to as a line level or operational level outside of the teams, did it make you a better leader once you got into the teams?
I mean,
or did it help you be in your opinion, do you think it helped you be a better leader?
I think it gave me some life experience. I've always felt like my quality as a leader was never up to me. It's kind of like it's kind of like if a comedian says, "Well, yeah, I'm funny." Yeah, you're funny if people laugh. If if you can get people laughing for an hour in a large auditorium, you're funny. Similarly, if people are willing to follow you, then you're a decent leader. But, I've seen a lot of leaders show up who believe they're good leaders. And, if you listen to the kind of the underground, what's being said, you realize that they're not. So I always try to reserve that judgment for somebody else to decide. I think that my experience on the ship definitely taught me some things about leadership, about, what makes people tick. How do you empathize with what a guy has going on in all aspects of his life that affects, getting the mission done. I was suddenly thrust into an environment where I had to know all those things, when before, my only experience prior to that was being a student, really. The wonderful thing about being a student is the only person you have to care about is yourself. And all of a sudden, I've got to care about everyone else and about myself least. So there were definitely things I learned that I carried forward, and I think probably served me well. But it's interesting coming from the surface community and going into the team. You sort of show up with a reputation whether you earned it or not. I can remember checking into Buds. I think I'd been there about a week, so I hadn't started yet, and there was a graduation. And there were some, DVs that came in for the graduation. I think some commanding officers of teams that the graduates were going to, things like that. And I remember I got paired. They're like, you got to be in your whites on this day and, show up at 8:00 and we're going to tell you what to do. And I was like, okay. And I was like an usher for the graduation, sort of duty for people who just checked in sort of thing. And I got paired with this commanding officer, and my job was to show him around. And I said, really? I've been here a week. There's rooms that I've never been in that I don't want to go in. And I'm supposed to show this guy around. He's been in the teams for 15 or 20 years. And they're like, just whatever he needs. And I'm like, all right. So I found this guy, and he sees me, and I'm wearing my Surface pen, and he kind of looks me up and down and sees my rank, sees my pen, and he looks at me and he goes, are you starting, Buds? I said, yes, sir. And he said, coming from the fleet? I said, yes, sir. And he goes, they don't have a good reputation right now. And I was like, okay.
Thanks for the encouragement.
And he's like, just don't quit. And I was like, don't think I said anything, but in my mind, I'm like, it was a long road to get here. It's dangerous for a guy who just checks into Buds to be like, I'm not going to quit, because I've never run across a guy who's like, yeah, I think I might quit. But in my mind, I'm like, I'm not here to quit. So, that was okay though, because what that told me was, reputations around here are earned. And I liked that. I liked that, I was nothing until I proved myself. So I took that for what it was. But what it told me also was that, the fleet has a reputation coming into Buds, and then, coming out of Buds and checking into a team, sort of same thing. Cause now I'm pretty senior. So I showed up to the team. I was a lieutenant, which is the same rank as the platoon commanders. But I'm not a platoon commander. So in the administrative sort of Navy way, I'm being ranked against them, which shouldn't really hurt me. But at the same time, basically, and I walked into my first SEAL platoon that was steeped in combat experience. And these guys basically looked at me, and whether or not they said this, I don't know, but they looked at me, and the impression I got was, they're looking at me like, how are you going to get me killed? And I was like, okay, time to learn a new thing, So I was sort of seen as a liability, I think, initially, which, every new officer coming out of BUD/S is kind of seen that way. But I think me, especially because I was more senior and they knew that in order to meet my career path and the milestones I had to make, they knew that I would be in a platoon commander position sooner than a guy coming out of BUD/S normally. So they took a special interest in making sure that I was ready. And I was very fortunate to have a guy named Steph Bass was my first troop chief. And you may know the name. He was early on, like maybe a month after 9/11, he was the guy up in Mazar-e Sharif who went in to get Mike Spann. So that's who I got paired with from day one. And and he and I are good friends today. And, I'm very thankful for that because he took that very seriously. He met me and he's like, sit down, we're going to talk. Okay. So it was a bit intimidating at first, but I'm thankful that he really took me under his wing and taught me what I needed to know.
This goes back, though, to my question about your experience already having been in a leadership position. Obviously, this goes towards you personally as a leader. I think the biggest thing in that situation is you came to the table with the humility to understand where you were at in the pecking order, regardless of what was on your collar, and to be open to learning and taking in the information that he was willing to impart on you.
Yeah, this was really nothing new for me. This had been kind of the previous two. At that point, it had been 4 years, about half that time spent at BUD/S. So, yeah, I felt like I was back standing on the flight deck of that ship in the Gulf of Oman, like, okay, here's this new environment, and I've got to learn what I need to learn. At this point, though, it was survival. So I showed up to the team in 2007, and at the time, it was almost guaranteed that you were going either to Iraq or Afghanistan. Almost, 99% guaranteed you're going to find yourself there. And I think that's probably why they took such a keen interest, because they're like, man, in 2 years, you're going to be a platoon commander, unless you really punt it into the stands, and then we're just going to get rid of you. But in 2 years, you're going to be a platoon commander leading people in probably Iraq or Afghanistan. So we want to make sure that you don't get us all killed. It's a very real thing. When I showed up to the ship, it was more, I've got to learn this because there's somewhere else I want to get to. So it was more of a personal goal or journey, whereas this was now like just kind of elevated into a different league, I think, in terms of the stakes. So yeah, so I was willing to learn what I could. And humility is a huge part of it. You have to, I walked into that platoon. I want to say there were 15 Bronze Stars, 3 Silver Stars, and a Navy Cross. These guys were steeped in combat experience. And, not to put emphasis on the wrong thing. It's not that the medals are what matters, but the fact that they had all experienced some pretty heavy stuff made me, forced me really to be even more humble and come in and be like, okay, what do I need to know? And I took it on personally as well. I became a student of stuff that had gone wrong. So I showed up to Team 10 about 2 years after the Red Wings incident. And it was still very raw in a lot of those guys' minds. And anyone who was willing to talk about it, I picked their brain. I wanted to know, because to me, it seemed like things had gone wrong. And I really came in knowing very little about it. The only connection I had is I knew Eric Christensen from the Naval Academy. He was a rower and actually taught English to my class when we were plebes. before, kind of as a stash, sort of. He was getting a degree at the time, but he had been a surface warfare officer, was lat transferring to BUD/S, and for some reason spent some time at the academy teaching, and then he would work out in the boathouse. So we all knew who he was, and we he's this large lieutenant who was headed to BUD/S, and we were all wide-eyed plebes. And he'd be in I remember he'd be in the boathouse doing pull-ups with his Birkenstocks on and his and we'd be like, "Sir, how many pull-ups can you do?" And he'd get off the bar and kind of stretch, and he'd be like, about 6. And we're like, 6? You need to be able to do more than 6? And he's like, "Nah, guys, BUD/S is all mental." I remember that like it happened yesterday. He's just the kindest guy. And I got to know him just a little bit, then, and learning that he was killed in the helicopter was kind of the first sort of sting in that long line of folks who I got to know. But I became very curious in that, and curious in other things too. And, what went wrong? Was it the bad luck of combat? Were there mistakes made? What were they? If I were an officer somewhere in that organization, whether it was staff on the ground what would I have been able to do differently, if anything, right? I started to ask these questions, and I started to become a student of it. And I think that served me well, just in really digging into the lessons learned, and, before I had to experience that stuff for myself. So
that's a huge leadership component, though, because understanding the importance of the event that happened and realizing that I may be in a similar situation down the road, and it's my job to the men that I'm leading at that point in time to at least have as much information as I can on mistakes, or I'm not saying there were mistakes, but just things that have happened in the past that I don't repeat, if possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was a history major at the Naval Academy, I've always tried to pull lessons from historical examples, whether it was, back in whatever, World War I, World War II, or, even recent history, NSW history or whatever. It's always been very interesting to me to be able to, and my own experiences as well. I mentioned that I had an opportunity to teach some combat leadership courses later in my career. And I think I did a decent job of taking my own experiences, and rather than getting up and kind of telling war stories or whatever, but actually picking apart, here's what happened, and this is where I made mistakes. This is where I could have done things a little bit differently, and how the outcome would have changed. I feel like I was always pretty good at that. And I've never had a problem sharing, honestly, things I've done well, things I've done poorly. And I've certainly made my share of mistakes. So it's not hard to come up with them.
You're the only one who's ever made mistakes.
Sometimes I feel that way.
I do want to rewind the tape back to the beginning, just briefly, so we get the full picture. But I'm going to make a pause in the rewind. As a surface warfare officer, how frequently does the selection or qualification test come up so that you can try to get to BUD/S?
So when I did it, it was really on you. There was nobody there who was like, "Oh, let me shepherd you through this process." It was, I mean, you can imagine, you're in the surface community. There's nobody there cares what, if you make it or not. You're on the ship. We're on the ship. This is what we do, and you're a part of it. So I had the sense at the time to just kind of keep my head down initially and just be like, I didn't walk onto the ship and say, "Hey guys, I'm here to go to BUD/S." I knew that would not land well. So I had the sense, or maybe the maturity, to understand that at the time. So I did. I just kind of put my head down, but I worked out a lot. So eventually people started to kind of ask questions, and I would tell them, well, I was an athlete in college and I want to stay fit. It's how I like to be. But eventually guys figured it out. I lost your question.
I was just asking about, I was under the impression that it was a scheduled or programmed.
Oh, right.
Hey, once every 4 months,
Yeah. So, right. So at the time, there was really no roadmap. I found out through that process that it was that every 6 months that a board met to kind of review the applications. So really you just kind of was a rolling application sort of thing.
So it's merely an application to get the opportunity to try the PFQ, or the screening test.
So the screening test was just part of the application.
Oh, okay.
And so what I had to do was go find a SEAL officer to do the screening with. So that required a little bit of networking. The first one, I was able to get hooked up with a guy named Josh Lasky, who's actually, he just made Admiral. I think he's out in the Pacific somewhere. He was the XO at Team 1 at the time. And so I went down and I interviewed with him, which was he was a lat transfer himself. So it was actually a fascinating interview in hindsight. So he spent about 2 hours with me. The first hour, he basically just explained the officer career path in the SEAL teams and sort of what it was. And then in a very sort of defining moment, he's like, okay, now I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I don't want the right answer or the wrong answer. I just want your answer. And I was like, okay. And what he did was he asked me questions that were like probing, sort of moral integrity type questions. And this is what's fascinating in hindsight. I did that interview in, I think it would have been April or May of 2005. And Red Wings happened in June. And he asked me this question. He asked me a lot of questions, but I remember this one. He said, okay, so you go on this mission. It's a long infill, and your job is reconnaissance. And you've got a small team of guys. And so obviously your mission success depends on remaining clandestine, and you can't be compromised. But eventually you are compromised, but not by the enemy, by a child. What do you do? And I mean, I struggled with the answer. And eventually he said, would you kill the kid? And I was like, wow, no, I don't think so. I'm not sure that is really necessary. And so I eventually sort of fumbled my way through this answer to where I said, well, I think that I would detain the kid, maybe take him with me. But I mean, I've been compromised. The kid has a mother. The mother's going to eventually want to know where the kid is. I mean, I can't continue the mission at that point. And, he didn't give me any sort of like, yeah, that's correct or wrong. He just kind of sort of very stoically nodded his head and moved on to the next question. And it was like a month later that happened. And I was like, how did this guy... But really, what the question had been modeled off of Bravo 20. Are you familiar with the Bravo 20? The SAS in Iraq, I think it was the Gulf War, when they were similar. I mean, he modeled his question after that, and it was a very similar. There's a book written about it, and I think a movie of the same name, where an SAS unit was compromised by a kid, and then basically the Iraqi army came in, and they ended. I think a couple of guys were killed. They went on E&E across Iraq. A couple of guys were captured, and just kind of a wild story. And I think that was really what it was modeled after. But it eerie to me that that was what happened in Afghanistan about a month after he asked me that. So anyway, interview, PFT. I think there was like a personal statement, maybe stuff like that. Nowadays, so then you put all that together in a package, you send it off the board, you wait, and they don't even really tell you. It just, there's a list that comes out that you check the website and you're on the list or not. So I wasn't on the list after that first one. And I was mid-deployment, and my commanding officer at the time, who I can't say enough about to help me get to where I wanted to go, this is what he did for me. This is incredible. He said, "I'm really sorry to hear about, not making the board." And I said, "It's okay." And he's like, "What are you going to do?" I said, I'm going to apply again. There's another board in 6 months. And he's like, "Okay, what do you need to do?" We're in the middle of deployment. He said, "What do you need to do to get ready?" I said, "Well, I probably need to take another PFT, and it would help to interview with a senior SEAL." And he said, "Okay, where are the nearest SEALs?" And I said, "Pearl Harbor." And he's like, "All right, well, when we transit back home, we're going to stop in Guam, Pearl Harbor, San Diego to drop the helicopter off, and then we'll go back to Washington. So what I'll do is when we pull into Guam, I'll fly you from Guam to Pearl Harbor, and you'll be there for about a week, and you can take your test and interview. But I'll fly you there, but you got to arrange lodging and all that." And I was like, "You're going to give me a vacation in the middle of this deployment?" And he's like, "I trust you. You're pretty focused on this, and I know you're going to go, get in a pool and get yourself ready to go." And so that's the thing. I mean, I'd been doing a lot of running, push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, but I hadn't really had a chance to get in a pool anywhere.
Didn't jump off the ship?
Well, we joked about that. I said, "Well, you can come down to 1 knot and I'll just swim next to the ship." He's like, "I'm not going to do that." So I did. I flew, and this is an amazing thing. We pulled into Guam on a Friday. So I had a Friday night in Guam, and then Saturday morning I got in an airplane and I flew to Hawaii. And I landed in Hawaii at like 5 p.m. on Friday, because you cross the international date line. If anybody could ever do that, like, I recommend, you can extend your weekend quite a bit. So I had a great time, and got in the pool, did some running, climbed up, ran up Diamond Head. That's people hike that, and there's a long staircase that goes to the top, and I was up running, and people are like, "What are you doing? Why are you running?" Like, they're, and I'm like, "Oh, I got to get ready for this.
I'm a fool."
Yeah, I'm crazy. So I did it. On the last day that I was in Hawaii, I took a PFT and I interviewed with the commanding officer of SEAL Delivery Vehicle Team 1 out there. And so put that together, sent in my second package, and that's what happened. Now, nowadays, it's very different. There's a much more defined roadmap. There's a thing called SOAS, SEAL Officer Assessment and Selection. And they basically take everybody who's either an officer or an officer candidate, so like a midshipman, either at ROTC or the Naval Academy, OCS guys, sometimes even civilians before they go to OCS. They'll take this whole group of people, and they just finished the last one, because it happens over the summer. And they bring them in and they do a much more kind of full-blown, there's all kinds of physical events and psych screenings and interviews, and I think they even do a mission planning thing, which is interesting considering they probably don't know. I don't know what it is. I'm not involved in the process, so I'm not sure exactly, and I didn't go through it myself. So, but I know that it's much more regimented now, and they do that. I mean, that's really once a year. There's several sessions. I think they're about 2 weeks or so in length, and I think there's 4 or 5 sessions, and it's every summer. So that would be the process now. But at the time, it was good luck. Send your application into the ether and hope that it comes back. So it was an interesting process to navigate, but it was 100% me. If I didn't take the initiative to do it, it wasn't going to happen. There was nobody holding my hand. It was just really, and figuring. I mean, I didn't really know any SEALs. The only SEALs I knew were my friends who went through, but they were brand new. And then I knew a couple, the lieutenants who were at the Naval Academy when I was there. I one of those guys hooked me up with some. He actually sent me down to San Diego to meet Josh Lasky and interview with him, and so it worked out. But it was a bit of a daunting process that I had to figure out.
Two things that you've mentioned that, for me, having done this podcast and spoken to multiple people who didn't make it through SEAL training, cycled out, had to go back to the fleet and work their way back in again.
Mm-hmm.
It goes to, when I say the two things that you said, the first thing that jumps out at me is that commander telling you surface warfare officers don't have a good reputation right now.
Yeah.
But you could flip the coin over, and I would imagine if you were talking to a commander on a ship with some of the men who had dropped out, failed out, whatever, out of BUD/S, and maybe some of the attitudes that they brought with them back into the fleet, maybe not having a good reputation. The other component, just real quick, what ties into what's really cool to hear about your leadership, who saw what you wanted and helped you get there, is I've had those guys who they had to go back to the fleet, and it was that mixed bag. It was the people like, shut up, you're not going to be able to make it back, quit your pipe dream. And then there were the good leaders who went, what do we need to do for you to get you back there?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, for sure. Those commanding officers, that one, and then the one who took over after him. I mean, that was a lot of risk for them. They're putting their reputation out there too, saying, "Yep, this guy's good to go." And that's a hard thing. There's the fleet's full of guys who didn't make it through BUD/S, and interestingly, on my ship there were two guys. One guy, young enlisted guy, I think he was probably an E5, the best sailor on the ship. 100, hands down, best sailor on the ship. And he wasn't one of my guys. He was in a different division. And I actually never knew he went to BUD/S until we were both standing on the weather deck one day, and we were, I think we were working with the Thai Navy or the Philippine Navy, something. I don't know. We went all over Southeast Asia. And this guy comes on board, and he's in his uniform, and he's got all kinds of decorations on his uniform, and he's wearing a trident on his uniform. And I saw it, and the guy standing next to me, he kind of chuckled, and I looked over at him, and I was like, "Are you laughing about the trident?" And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "That guy was in my BUD/S class." And I went, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, he was," because in the BUD/S classes will have a handful of international candidates, and they go through BUD/S and then they go back, and some of them do phenomenally well. A lot of them don't do well and just kind of get pushed through. And he's like, "Yeah, that guy he just got pushed through, but he's got his trident now." And I said, "I didn't know you were in BUD/S." And he's like, "Yeah." And I forget what class it was, but it blew me away that, and he was fantastic. And I was like, "What happened?" And usually this is the other thing. When I run across people who didn't make it, there's always they usually say one of two things. They either say, "Well, I broke my leg, and, the time it would have taken me to get healthy was too much, so they sent me away." Or I've heard this one, "Yeah, I punched an instructor in the face." And it's like, okay. If you break your leg and you're a good dude, they're going to keep you around. And there are injuries that are eventually like, "Dude, sorry, but it's not going to work." But a broken leg heals. They'll, if you have the time, they'll do it. I've never known anybody to punch an instructor in the face. I don't know where that comes from, but I think it's more of like I was just too tough for this stuff. But this guy was like, and I asked him, "What happened? Why'd you leave?" And he's like, "That shit wasn't for me, man." I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "I didn't like the cold water." I was like, "Okay, respect." I mean, to be honest about it and to be like, "Hey, I mean, he even said, I've got all the respect in the world for those guys, but it just wasn't for me." And I was like, okay. And, I think that attitude was a significant component as to why he was such a sharp sailor on the ship. By contrast, there was another kid who I think gave me the broken leg story. And constantly talked about going back and, all this and everything. And he even had a ball cap, like a black ball cap with a subdued trident on it that he would wear. And I remember telling him once, I was like, hey, man, I'd be careful wearing that hat. And he's like, why? It's my community. And I was like, not yet, and I didn't want to be like degrading and put him down or anything, but I was just like, not yet,
Well, and also too, you're in an awkward position because you are as an officer.
Exactly. And I'm also not there yet myself. So, but I just was sort of like, hey, I have a sense of the culture, and I can tell you that they're not going to like, if you run across a guy, he's going to start asking you questions. And when he finds out that you aren't a SEAL, he's going to want that hat back. But he didn't care. And there's not a lot of SEALs in Everett, Washington anyways. So, if you're going to get away with it, I guess that's the place to do it. But I left the ship. I went to Buds. I still, a very close friend of mine to this day was a junior officer with me on the ship. And, I would stayed in contact with him. And he called me once and he's like, hey, and that kid who, with the hat, he's like, hey, he got orders to Buds. I was like, really? And I had just finished, or I was about to finish. I was right at the end. And I said, sweet. He's going to be probably in the next class. I'll look out for him. And I was going through this course right after Buds for the officers called the Junior Officer Training Course. And at the time, it was held in this classroom that kind of overlooked the grinder for second phase, but first phase was right there. And you'd always see the new classes because they were huge and everyone's got a white shirt on and, 150, 200 guys running into this classroom that was underneath kind of where we were. And it was a balcony and we had like a lunch break or something. So we're all standing there eating our sandwiches. And I know that the guy is going to be in that class. So I yell down, hey, does anybody know this guy? And, in those situations, like you're in a large class and running, somebody starts yelling, you just keep your head down. You don't look. That's like the one thing you don't do. You don't, you don't do that. And of course, nobody's looking up or anything. And I'm like, hey, anybody? And this guy who had already run into the classroom underneath where we were pushes his way back through the crowd and like cranes his neck, looks up at me and goes, that asshole quit. And I went, what? He's like, yeah, we haven't even started yet and he quit. And I was like, well, that checks. That makes sense. So, it's, you can tell.
I want to go backwards even a little bit further. I want to get you as a young boy. You mentioned living in San Diego. Mm-hmm. Is that hometown? Is that where you were born?
No. We moved all over. I was born in New Jersey. I think I spent through first grade in Northern Virginia, Reston. And then we moved to South Carolina. I lived there for 4 or 5 years. And then out here to San Diego, and then finished up high school, all of high school in Connecticut. So we moved all over.
Because of your dad's work?
Yeah. A lot of people ask, was he in the military?
Felt like it.
He was. Before I was born, he was a Navy pilot, but he was out by the time I was born. So that wasn't why we just moved around.
Where does that pivot moment happen in your life that I want to be a Navy SEAL?
For me, I don't think it really dawned on me until I was at the Naval Academy. One of the advantages of going to that school is that you don't just get to meet people from different communities, you get to know them really well. So, I knew pilots, I knew Marines, I knew submariners, I knew SEALs. And then your classmates and the midshipmen you're there with are gravitating towards their sort of different interests. And it just kind of worked out that the guys I was friends with, outside of rowing, were interested in that. And then it just sort of happened that I realized probably, I don't know, a year or two in, I was like, oh, these are kind of my people. I showed up to the Naval Academy wanting to be a Marine, and Plebe Summer knocked that out of me. I was like, I mean, I love the Marines, but I don't think I can be a part of this. The surface guys were all they were always kind of disappointing to me. The pilots were a little bit too like, I go supersonic. And I was like, okay. And which was odd because my dad was a pilot and I grew up loving naval aviation. I still do. I go to an air show if I can spare the time. I mean, I love that stuff. But I never really wanted to be a part of that community. And it just didn't, the people, not that they're bad people, they're wonderful people, but they're just not my type. And then the subs, I'm not smart enough to be on a sub, pure and simple. I actually did a 30-day sub cruise when I was a midshipman, and I was like, because it's interesting.
29 days too long.
Yeah. Sneaking around underwater. I mean, that mission was interesting to me. So I was like, I'll try this. And the guys were fine. It wasn't that. I was just like, this isn't as appealing to me as.
This October 28th and 29th, the Military Officers Association of America is bringing together 3,000 voices, military leaders, warfighters, veterans, and families at National Harbor in Maryland for their inaugural conference, Total Force Plus. This isn't just another military conference. It's a mission to advance solutions for our military and veteran community, including leadership development, quality of life, military transition, and maximizing the veterans' experience. It's all on the table. This is where the next generation of military solutions will be tackled, at the first and only military conference where people outrank everything. And because the mission is so important, MOA is making attendance free for those who are currently serving, the spouses of those currently serving, and all federal employees within the DoD and VA. Secure your seat now, as tickets are limited and offered on a first-come, first-served basis. Visit TotalForcePlus.org to see if you qualify for your free ticket and to register for the conference.
So I really just kind of gravitated to the people. And the SEAL officers were by far the most fun. There were a couple of SEAL senior enlisted at the Academy at the time who were awesome. And I was like, man, I want to serve with these guys. This would be cool. But honestly, I mean, my first interest in it, I sort of thought to myself, like, I mean, that sounds horrible. I don't know if I could do that. So there was some doubt, initially of like, I don't know if I have what it takes. I think probably everybody goes through that at some point. But, as I got a little older and matured more and really figured out, I set my sights on that. I was like, and it was really more, the draw was the people. And I did like the challenge of it was appealing to me. I've always enjoyed a physical challenge. But that was just the physical challenge aspect of it was just kind of what you had to do. It wasn't for the physical challenge. And so I was able to compete for and won a billet to go to, at the time, what was called Many Buds, which was a summer cruise that you did before your senior year. And it was 4 weeks, 2 weeks of buds, and then 2 weeks of kind of TAD with the SEAL team. You sort of, they basically, you did whatever they asked you to do, sort of thing. And the buds part was, I mean, it was legit buds. And they hated us because we were midshipmen. We were not even officers yet, and they called us mini studs, and it was buds. It was first phase, which, was fun, and we all were fit, and we wanted to do it, so it wasn't like, it wasn't a big deal, but it was a good taste of what it's like. And then doing the TAD portion to the SEAL team, I think they sent us out to Nyland, California, which is the desert training facility. And I think I want to say it was SEAL Team 5 was finishing up some land warfare training out there. And they were like, "Hey, who are you guys?" And we're like, "We're midshipmen." And they're like, "Really? Like, you guys want to shoot the rest of our ammo?" And we're like, "Yes." And they said, "Okay, but you got to clean the range." And we were like, "No problem." Like, manual labor, we were all about it. That was like our wheelhouse. So it's funny for me to think now, because it's like, man, Nyland in the summertime picking up brass, not the deal. But we were so excited to be there, it didn't matter. So we went, and I mean, they let us shoot everything they had, everything. And, there were some guys out there, and one of them was actually a guy named Danny Fowles, who was this sort of large, imposing guy, and he was like full of energy. And this is a guy who was at the end of this training block. I know that he had been operating on little sleep. And he was so enthusiastic. He's like, "Get in here." He had a Mark 48 that was his job in the platoon. So he was like, "Come on, I'm going to run you through my peg. Grab that ammo. What are you doing just standing there?" So we'd run over and grab the ammo, and he'd like, "Get in here, load it up," and slap the tray. Okay. And then, front sight and downrange, and we'd be just, hammering away. And he kept that energy up all day. And it's like 120 degrees. And he never, and I remember noticing that. And, I went through it, and then I went and shot the sniper rifles, and then whatever the rockets or whatever else they had. But I always saw that energy. It never stopped. And I thought, oh, this is the community I want to be in. And then a couple of years later, I end up in Buds, and Danny Fowles, one of my first phase instructors.
With the same intensity?
With the same intensity. And I was excited. I was like, "Oh, it's Danny Fowles." And he's like, "Yeah, I don't know who you are." Hit the surf. So a little bit different relationship, but he's a fantastic guy, and we've been friends since. So
had you had much experience shooting prior to going to Buds?
No, not really. Here and there, qualified.
Definitely not fully automatic weapons.
No, no. I didn't grow up hunting or anything like that. No, nothing really.
So what year did you graduate high school?
98.
And you did a year of just college before you went to the academy. So what was your plan? Were you already thinking military at that time?
Yes. And so this is the trend in my life, is that I apply for something that's kind of selective, and then I don't get selected. So then I apply again. It's happened several times. So I applied to the Naval Academy out of high school, and I didn't get in. And so I went to college for a year and reapplied. And I got in. But yes.
In that initial application process to the Naval Academy, you were thinking Marine Corps?
Yeah. By the time I was finishing up high school, I was, and I had sort of set my sights on the Naval Academy by maybe early junior year of high school. And it really just kind of popped into my head out of the blue. I don't know. It's just kind of one of those things that, you know how it is. It just sort of grabbed me. And maybe it was, my dad is a graduate, so I was obviously exposed to that from him. He never, in fact, he tried to convince me not to go. That's a funny story, because I was sometime in my junior year where he started to, the first time I mentioned it, he was like, "Okay." And then he started to get the sense that I was serious, and he sat me down one day. I remember this, and he said, "Listen, about the Naval Academy." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I don't think you should apply." And I went, "What?" And he said, "Let me break it down for you." And I wore glasses at the time. I've since had laser surgery, but I didn't have great eyesight. So he said, "You don't have great eyesight, and that puts you into a more competitive category. There's a waiver, but you got to compete for that." He's like, "And let's be honest, you're not the best student. You're not a terrible student, but you're not the best student." He goes, "The Naval Academy is typically full of like valedictorians." And I was like, "Okay." And he said, "And the last piece is, I don't think you're going to like it." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you don't like following rules. And there's a lot of rules." And I was like, "Okay, fair on that one." And I said, "Well, Dad, if it's all the same to you, I'd like to still apply. And he said, okay, then I'm behind you. But I think he felt like he had to give me the warning. So I was never pushed to go there. It was all my interest. And from that point forward, he was my biggest fan. So,
why didn't your dad stay in to make it a career? Did he ever tell you?
Yeah. Well, so he was a carrier attack pilot, in the late 60s and 70s. And then he went to test pilot school, and he was actually, he had kind of set his sights on the astronaut program. So a guy named Mike Smith, who was the pilot of the Challenger that went down, was a really close friend of his, and they went through test pilot school together. And he and Mike, they had both, that was where they wanted to go. And my dad, as a test pilot, he did carrier suitability, and specifically in the A-5, which was a large supersonic reconnaissance plane. And at one point in his career, I think he was actually in an A-7 at the time, but he had to punch out of the A-7 on approach in, I think, Pinehurst, New Jersey. And I mean, 300 feet, he held onto the airplane as long as he could, and then punched. And the board that convened, I think, didn't see it in his favor. So the way he described it to me is, he said, I kind of saw the writing on the wall that my career wasn't gonna go. And he's like, I made a decision at the time. And he ended up going to business school, and from that point, and so he got out at about 10 years. But that's why he didn't make it a career. So, and then actually got really sick kind of right about the time I was born. I think he got out about a year before I was born, maybe. And then right about the time I was born, he got really sick. He was hospitalized for a long time. They weren't quite sure what was wrong with him. They thought it was cancer. It wasn't cancer. Spent a few years learning to walk again. So, it was, I guess, kind of a good thing that he had gotten out, because he wouldn't have been able to stay. But anyway, that's why I didn't make it a career.
This is going to be a component when we get to your transition out, but the rowing component.
Mm-hmm.
Had you rowed or crewed, or whatever the proper term is, prior to going to the academy?
No. Well, I did for that year in college. That was really technically my novice year. I went to college to play baseball. And I had, I probably stretched my baseball dream maybe just a scotch too far. But I entertained,
What position did you play?
I was an outfielder. I could run. That's the one thing I could do.
Was that your sport like the entire time as a kid growing up?
Yeah. I mean, I played 3 sports in high school. I ran cross country in the fall, basketball in the winter, and baseball in the spring. But baseball I always had a love for, and that was what I wanted to. I wanted to see if I could play in college. But I went to such a small high school that college coaches, this is hysterical. So I went to Lehigh University for that year. And I think I was a junior, and it was prior to my junior season. So I went and met with the coach at Lehigh, and we sat down and talked for a little bit. And he said, "All right, let's go over some stats. What was your batting average last season?" So it would have been my sophomore year. And I said, huh. And he's like, "What's funny?" And I said, "I batted .749. And he's like, "Don't worry, you'll play for us." And I said, No. There's something I need to explain. I said, "We were a varsity team, but we played a middle school schedule. So, I batted .749 against like 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds maybe." Yeah. So I had to be honest about that. And he's like, "Oh, okay." And then started asking questions about my school, and there was no chance I was going to get recruited. It was more of a, come out and try out and see, we'll see what we're working with. And I said, okay. And when I showed up to Lehigh, the tryouts weren't for a couple months, I think mid-October or something like that. And I was kind of bored. And I was walking, I remember every day I walked back from class to my dorm, and I would pass the gym, which was on the way, and there was this group of people gathering. And I was, I would see them every day. And so finally I stopped and I said, what do you guys do? Like, I see you guys every day. And they're like, we're the crew team. And I went, like rowing? And they're like, yeah, you want to join? And I was like, kind of. And they're like, you're in. Because it was a club team, and they were happy
without a long list of people banging down the door to get on.
They were happy to have anybody. And I was like, okay, and I'll try this out. But I want to play baseball, and the tryouts are in a month or so. So I started rowing, and the coach, the coach liked me, and the sport grew on me pretty quickly, and I liked the folks who were doing it, and it was challenging. It was, I was developing muscles that I didn't know I had. And it just became a lot of fun. And eventually I just I let go of the baseball, which I like to say, I just sort of grew out of baseball, I guess. And it was the right thing. It was a bit serendipitous, but it was the right thing, because I'm convinced that my participation in rowing as a freshman at Lehigh University is probably why I got into the academy. Maybe, I don't know. I tried to pull that out of my coach years later, and he was like, "Nope, you got in on your own merit." And I was like, "I don't think so. I think that you helped me out." And he's like, he'd have like a sly smile on his face. He's like, "No, man, all you." And I was like, "I still don't believe you." I still don't believe him to this day. I'm pretty sure that they may have taken my application out of the trash and said, "Oh, we'll hang on to this guy."
Do you think it was because of a relationship he had with somebody at the academy, or because of the rowing aspect?
Well, the service academies don't technically recruit, but coaches can have an influence.
Because don't you have to play a sport during your time at the academy?
You do, but it doesn't have to be a varsity sport.
Oh, okay.
So, if you're not a varsity athlete, you got to do something else. Usually it's like a club team or the company intramurals or something like that. But yeah, you have to do a sport. But the coach, who was recruiting, at the time there was freshman crew, and then there was varsity crew, and so they don't do that anymore. But which is a bummer, because it was really cool that you just had a freshman event. So when you went to the national championships, you look down the line and everybody's a freshman. Some of them, like the guys at Cal probably rowed in the Olympics at some point, but they're still freshmen. 32-year-old freshmen.
On paper.
Yeah. But that was a fun event. And the guy, the freshman coach at Navy was the guy who handled recruiting. And I think he was trying to, he did a lot of recruiting just based on guys' desire to be there. And so I think he saw me, and I had been in contact with him. So,
hey, at the end of the day, whatever works, right?
Whatever works. So, but I loved. I mean, that's my when I go back to a reunion, it's the rowers who, and they're still all my closest friends to this day. So, that was the right place for me to be.
Once you were into the academy, taking your dad's advice or heeding your dad's advice, how were you as far as the rules and the discipline?
Well, he just sort of sat back with popcorn and watched. He's like, we'll see how this ends up. And every once in a while I ran afoul of the system, and of course I'd tell him the story, and he just would howl with laughter. He'd be like, "Yep, can't do that." So I think it was more entertaining for him than anything else. But he enjoyed, he enjoyed seeing me row, and I think that meant a lot to him. His brother had missed winning a varsity letter. My uncle was on the track team, and their father, I think it was because their father had passed away, and he wasn't able to make the pin relays, which was, I think, you had to race in the pin relays to earn a letter. So he missed a letter because of that. And then my dad ran club cross country and never made it to the varsity team. So I was able to win a letter at the academy, and I think that really meant a lot to my dad. To you know, sort of changing his initial perception of, I don't think this is the right place for you, to, nah, it's the right place for you. So,
Did you always row as part of a team, or did you ever do individual?
no, I was never a sculler. I just, and I mean, it's not that I scull from time to time now, but it's crew. You know, there is a difference between, you know, it's the working with the team that I think is what I really enjoy about it. I mean, I could go out and scull and come back and it would be like, well, I got to work out in, but I can go run too. What I enjoy is getting in a boat with other guys and making it work. So,
Before I get to a question about buds, just something I'm thinking about real quick. Where were you at on 9/11?
I was a junior at the Naval Academy.
And what was that impact like for you? And then from your family's perspective of you now heading towards active duty?
Yeah. That was a wild day. I remember I had the period off. And I went up to talk to a professor of mine who happened to be an intel officer who had just come from the Pentagon. And I was talking to him about a paper that was due or something like that. And I walked past the teacher's lounge and all the teachers were in there staring at, there was like a TV on top of the refrigerator. And we're all looking at it with like concerned looks. And I kind of poked my head in and I saw the smoke from one of the towers. And I thought, oh man. I said, was there a fire? And they're like, yeah, something. Because, the first plane wasn't really on film. I mean, it was, we found out later there were, cameras around, but it wasn't televised. And so no one really knew. And I walked down the hall to this guy and I said, hey, do you know what's going on with the World Trade Center? He's like, no, what's up? And I said, I don't know. They're all the teachers in the lounge. He's like, let's go take a look. So we walked down and the two of us arrived right like maybe 10 seconds before the second plane hit, and we watched it. And I told you he was an intel officer, had just come from the Pentagon. It was his office that was hit. And he saw it happen, and he looked at me and he said, remember when I told you about bin Laden last week? I was like, yeah. He goes, this was bin Laden. And I went, how do you know that? And then he left because he's like, I've got to get to the Pentagon, which is a weird thing now in hindsight to think, because he was a professor assigned to the Naval Academy and he just left. And he was driving over to Alexandria when we didn't see him for a week. I mean, he was over there, sifting through rubble. And then came back and kind of told us all about, and I mean, it would hit him hard. A lot of guys he knew. But anyway, the impact of that at the time, I was still very focused on, I've got to get through this school. This is, this is not easy for me. As my dad noted, I wasn't the best student. And so I don't know that I really thought too much about it. And then about a month later, we went up to row in the head of the Charles at Boston. And Navy, we were okay. We weren't like a top placed crew, but we were okay. And we rowed in the Championship 8 race, which is the last race on Sunday. And it's kind of the big race, all the fast crews, that's the ones that a lot of people go to see. And I remember thinking, the crowd, and it's a well-attended event. I mean, it's 3 miles of river and the banks are lined the whole way and there's people cheering. But I never really thought about that while I'd rowed in Boston before, except this one. And I felt like the entire city of Boston was like, because Navy rowing down, and everyone was just like, I don't know. It was this weird feeling of like, suddenly I feel like I have the whole country behind us, behind, what we're doing. And I remember it was really a stirring moment. I have no idea how we did in that race. I don't remember. I could probably look up the results, but it didn't matter. And coming back from that, and also the drive up, this is the first time I'd really left the academy since that had happened. And, the drive up, you come up the Jersey Turnpike and the New York skyline. So the first time I'd actually seen with my own eyes the skyline. And I mean, I was an East Coast guy my whole life. My sister lived in Manhattan. I knew New York City. And I think that was when the impact really hit me. Like, what the, and like someone had really punched me, Now I found out this years later. In fact, just before my dad's death, I found out. So 9/11 happens. None of the phones work. I try to call my sister. Can't get through. My grandmother lived with us in Connecticut. I get through to her. And she's like, yeah, it's awful, isn't it? And I said, yeah. And I said, where's Erica? It's my sister. She said, well, Erica's in England. I said, oh, okay. All right. I said, where's Dad? And she said, Dad's on an airplane right now. I went, what? She said, yeah, Dad flew to LA. I went, what? She's like, yeah. I'm like, have you heard from him? She's like, no, he's not going to land for another few hours. And I'm like, okay. That was kind of a heavy moment. Now, fast forward years, and my dad was like, he was on an airplane that left Logan and went to LA at about 8 o'clock in the morning on 9/11. And he told me this story, maybe a month or so before he died. And he's like, yeah, I was actually manifested on Flight 11. I went, what? He's like, yeah, on my initial ticket, because he worked on Long Island at the time. And he and a business partner were flying out to LA to meet with a customer. And he's like, yeah, I was manifested. We were both manifested on Flight 11 and it got changed. The travel agent just changed it. I went, what? He's like, yeah. So the A7, best friends with Mike Smith, who, I mean, had he, and then manifested on Flight 11 that was changed at the last minute. I'm like, Dad, what is it with you in aviation, man?
Unique touch points in his life.
Jesus. But I mean, that was a heavy thing. And I didn't know that. I knew he was on that plane, but I didn't know that he was actually like on that plane at a certain point. So, 9/11 was very real for me. And the impact, I think, was a slow burn. Initially when it happened, I was like, man, this sucks. And then gradually over time, it started to sink in. And really, I mean, it obviously shaped and impacted the trajectory of my career. And it was, 10 years to the day of 9/11, I found myself in a firefight in Afghanistan going, what am I doing? This is 10 years this has been going on. And little did I know at the time there was another 10 to go. So, 9/11's a pretty impactful. That might be the real answer to the initial question. What was something about what was the career?
Most impactful thing in your career?
Probably 9/11, I guess, is the real answer. That was that certainly changed everyone's life.
I take opportunities to ask people about that because it's crazy now to think that, in essence, it's become our country's Pearl Harbor. And what I mean by that is the kids today, they're just learning about it in a history book. Mm-hmm. It's there's no actual touch point to it. Yeah. Where for people like us, we remember that morning. Yeah. We remember seeing the second plane fly in. Yeah. And especially anybody from military or law enforcement who was on the East Coast at the time. It Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. A slightly different context, but yeah. I took my kids to the World Trade Center Memorial in Manhattan a couple of years ago, for visiting my sister. who lives in Brooklyn now. And I mean, they're young, you know, and it's hard for them to, I mean, it's a nice memorial. There's, you know, waterfall going into the ground, but, and, you know, the names and everything. And I mean, I have a hard time being there, and not feeling a lot of emotion. And for them, you know, it's just kind of another thing. But I try, you know, without being too over the top about it, I try to help them understand the impact. Certainly that had on my life, but then really, you know, what it meant for America.
The thing for me, so I was born in New York, grew up here in California, though. My mom was from California. She wanted to come back out west. But there's a piece of me that always feels, I put it in air quotes, but I feel right when I'm in the city. I don't know why. I just love it. And my dad passed away February 2001. Flew him back to bury him. And my ex-wife kid's mom had never been to the city, never been to New York. My cousin was a school bus driver. So he basically, we had a one day just whirlwind, let's go see as much as we can. And he would basically drive us, drop us off at an intersection, let us walk around, go up to the Empire State Building, whatever. When you're ready, I'll come back pick you up. We're getting near the end of the day and we're heading towards the Twin Towers. And she turns to me and she says, we'll be back. She goes, I love this city. We'll be back. It's just too much. I've kind of hit overload and we didn't go. But then we were back for our anniversary later that year in October. People saying, are you going to fly? Yeah, we're going to fly. Yeah. And I remember walking down to Ground Zero and it was just, as you got closer, the level of debris as it rose and the missing posters and still seeing it smoldering, it still sticks with me today.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not something that'll ever not be a part of my very vivid memory.
Right.
You know, yeah.
Let's jump forward to buds. You mentioned many people don't make it through because of injury. Were you able to make it through all the way through first time?
Yeah.
And no issues at all?
Everyone has issues. But as far as medical, no.
Going through that mini buds, how much of an advantage was that for you?
Some. I mean, I think the advantage there is just you get a taste of the community before you really have to step into it, and so you get a sense of the challenge ahead of you. So there's some advantage there, but I mean, yeah, that's about it.
You mentioned being in a firefight 10 years later, and I know this can almost sound rhetorical. Any apprehensions of actually leading men into combat? Like when it's actually time, you know, you're going through all the training, you're now in charge of a platoon and it's time to deploy into a combat situation. So you're now, not only are you responsible for yourself, you're responsible for your men. And not that the men you're working with aren't responsible for each other also, but it's a different position to be in a leadership position.
Yes. I mean, excitement. I felt a lot of that. You know, I deployed twice to Iraq, which were okay deployments. And then by the time I got to the platoon commander position, that was my deployment to Afghanistan, my first one. And, you know, I was excited to go. Which is a weird thing.
There are a lot of veteran and first responder owned coffee companies out there. Trident Coffee is one of them, but they're different. They're cold brew experts, and their beans are roasted for cold brew optimization. But for those of you who love hot coffee, this is a benefit to you as well. Hot or cold, their coffees taste amazing without the bitterness. Their instant cold brew is infused with powerful ingredients for performance, focus, and wellness, including antioxidants and electrolytes. ensuring smooth, steady energy with no jitters and no crashes. This isn't just coffee, it's fuel for your brain and your body. Whatever your coffee needs, Trident has you covered. From a variety of great tasting roasted beans to their instant cold brew and nitro cold brew in a can for when you're on the go. However you drink it, Trident Coffee is coffee upgraded. Get yours now at tridentcoffee.com and use the promo code TDP15 for 15% off your purchase.
I don't know that you should really be excited to go to war. I've wrestled with this, I was, but I don't know that you should be. And in leading, I mean, I knew, I mean, I liked it. I liked leading. I liked being in charge, because it put me in a position where I could do some positive to affect the lives of the guys who were with me. Not that that wouldn't be possible if I wasn't the officer in charge, but I was in a position where I could make decisions that would save lives. I also was very aware that I could make decisions that could lead to lives ending, which was, something that as I mentioned before, I constantly became a student of. I liked the focus that I had to have on, the details, the planning, the contingency stuff. I liked that. I liked that I was the guy who got to go make a lot of the relationships with our supporting units. My absolute favorite unit on the planet is the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. I love those guys with all of my heart. They're phenomenal humans, and the skill that they have to do what they do is I mean, I'm in awe of them all the time. And I got to be the guy who had the relationships and held those relationships and made sure that our planning was tight with them. And I learned so much from them, and I liked that I was in a position to do that. And that I had sort of a different responsibility than just, my own little section of my own little job on the battlefield or whatever. And so, most of what I would feel was excitement. Anytime we were getting ready to get on the helicopter and go, I felt this almost like at the beginning of a journey sort of thing every time. I think that I developed some combat cynicism, a little bit jaded as it wore on. I think that's probably pretty natural, but as it went forward, as I got deeper into it, the question I would constantly wrestle with is why are we doing this? Like what? And then the realization that it's my job to at least articulate the why to these guys who are risking their lives. And that became tricky. And what I noticed was the 9/11 sort of emotion carries you for a little bit. But then you start to be like, okay, well, the guy we're going after has got nothing to do with Al Qaeda. I'll bet you he's never even heard of bin Laden. So what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Because the risk is going to be there. It's a lethal environment that we're going to step into. So why? And these are questions that I was asking myself. And if I was asking myself these questions, the guys were damn sure asking these questions. So it became this thing where I had to really take a hard look at figuring out the answer to that so that I couldn't bullshit the guys, because they see right through that. And, I think that I evolved as a combat leader because of that. I went from sort of boyish excitement to really wanting to understand what the hell it was I was being asked to do, or what I was asking them to do. And that's kind of that was my evolution, I think, as a combat leader. There's a lot of apprehension in that, I feel.
You use the analogy that, you shouldn't have felt excited to go to combat. But I say that that's unfortunately the catch-22 of our careers, where you put yourself, you raise your hand and say, I want to be part of a specific unit that is going to be called on. And yes, the training is great. What you learn is great and everything. But there is that component that you are going to have to deploy this in a life and death situation. And so I would say that not excited, or I'm just putting my own spin on this. It's that you want to prove to yourself that you can perform at that level.
Yeah.
I think the sports analogy sometimes get overused.
Yeah.
Yes. If you're a professional football player, you want to make the Super Bowl. But if you lose a Super Bowl, you don't lose your life, whereas you go through all this training, because if you go back in time, and I'm interested to get your point on your perspective on this, because I've heard interviews with SEALs who came during the peacetime era, those late 80s into the early 90s, where there was nothing going on. So it was just all training and a very lack of real world experience. But then you mentioned you come into your first platoon and every member has enough experience for multiple lifetimes that we're going to now start losing again.
Yeah.
So I think it is that teeter-totter catch-22 of, yes, we are trained to the maximum level to perform in a situation, but hopefully, in all reality, we hope that we never have to.
Yeah. Yeah. But, that's a really tricky part about leading in the teams today, is that, a lot of guys coming through BUD/S now grew up kind of watching all this, and probably were influenced by a lot of it. And by the time they got old enough to go to BUD/S, this is sort of the life they imagined. And it's not really like that. And there's important things that we're doing, but the days of 60 ops on a deployment, those are long gone. I think, I don't know that I always felt this way, but looking back, it's just sort of a strange, because you mentioned wanting to see if you can sort of compete at that level. It was never a game.
And I apologize if I made it
No, it's not. But I understand that sentiment, and I think that a lot of people do feel that way. That's like, well, I want to be tested in combat. And a couple things I learned. Experience in combat is not a prerequisite to performing well in combat. And I learned that firsthand. I watched that happen. When I took over as a platoon commander, my platoon chief was this sort of gruff guy. Great man, and we're still friends, but gruff, and had a lot of experience. I had some, and there was the draft for, we get the list of who's new and coming to the team, and most of the guys are coming out of BUD/S. There's a handful of guys coming from other places, but most of the guys are brand new. And for some reason, I guess BUD/S had provided us a ranked list, which is based on, I don't know,
arbitrary measures,
how fast they can run, or I don't know what it is. Who knows what the BUD/S instructors used to rank. So they ranked this list out, and it was like maybe 20 names. And the platoon chiefs, so mine, and then we had 3 platoons in our troop at the time. And so there were two other platoon chiefs, and they're kind of food fighting for the guys. And the other two chiefs are really battling it out for like the top guys, the guys who are ranked at the top. And my platoon chief is kind of sitting there with a sour look on his face, and I'm not really a part of this discussion. I'm not. I mean, I'm there. I'm interested, but I'm not really involved. And I was just kind of watching it happen, and I was sort of waiting for my platoon chief to be like, yeah, and we're going to take that guy. Finally, he says something. He goes, fuck it. Give me the bottom 7 guys and 2 good team leaders. And I was like, maybe 1 ringer. And he's like, shut up, sir. Give me the bottom 7 guys. And I'm like, okay, we'll make this work. And I'll tell you what, those guys who came into our platoon were phenomenal. And he was right. He's like, I don't care. They made it through BUD/S. I'll turn them into good SEALs. And he did. And they performed exceptionally in combat. And I was like, it was over a course of time, but I became this believer and like, all right. In our process, right? You make it through the process. There's merit there. Number 1. Obviously, some SEALs are better than others, but there's merit. You've got a good raw product. And then B, the idea that you really have, it's leadership. You have the ability to mold somebody into what you need them to be. And he did that with those guys. And it was, they were great. Phenomenal.
But it's like you said, though, excelling or being a superstar in training doesn't necessarily always equate over to a superstar or excelling when it's real.
Maybe not. But it's a good indicator. And I think our training, at least, in my experience, I think was real enough and hard enough that I felt pretty prepared. At least tactically. I sort of wished that there were some things people had told me before my first day, but I learned, I was a quick study. So I figured out things quickly, but if my worst day had been my first day, it would have been a lot worse. But fortunately I had built up some experience by then and it worked out. But anyway, it was an interesting leadership study in that one. And I was excited to see it happen.
As a platoon commander, what was your ratio of administrative to operational?
I don't know. It was all part of it. As on deployment, my days were pretty packed with, when we weren't in the field, with either writing the reports for the previous mission, preparing for the next one, writing awards. That took a lot of time. All of the various administrative things that you have to do. But it was all connected and all related. And I didn't, I never really looked at it like, oh God, I got to sit in front of the computer now. Like I always saw that as like, it's all part of it. And I'm preparing, and I spent, a considerable amount of my time preparing with, mission planning and things of that nature. And really talking with the guys and figuring out how to tackle different problems. So even if it wasn't operational, meaning like I'm actually in the field doing my job, it was all still one big soup of what you had to do. So I never, I get this question sometimes from people who are, not like midshipmen at the Naval, but sometimes civilians who want to be SEALs. And, they wrestle with this thing about, well, do I be an officer or do I be enlisted? I'm like, it's just a weird question to me. And their reasoning is the only thing I really have a problem with, because the reasoning is often, well, I want to do cool stuff. And I know that officers don't get to go do cool stuff. And I'm like, I mean, I did cool stuff. Don't tell anybody. Yeah, I had to do other stuff too, but so do they. It's a very immature look at kind of, what they project to be their time. And I'm like, look, dude, do you want to be a SEAL or not? I mean, the routes there are a little bit different, but once you're there, I mean, yeah, eventually the officer job and the enlisted job kind of diverge a bit, but it's a team. You need to be a part of the team regardless of your rank. And by the way, I mean, you can lead regardless of your rank. That doesn't have anything to do with it. So, I don't know. That question always just kind of makes me chuckle. I get it surprisingly often. Should I go officer or enlisted? I'm like, I don't care. What do you want to do? You want to be a SEAL or not?
I think there's two parts of it, though. I think one of it is a lack of information. There's a perception that as an officer, you're more in the rear with the gear.
A generalized that's the perception, I suppose.
Combining that with the fact that, yes, as an officer, there is more of an admin component than as even a junior officer or even an enlisted. But from the enlisted side, the further up you move, there's more admin components to your assignment.
Sure.
So it's going to be a component for you no matter what.
Yeah, it eventually will. Yeah, of course. But I don't know. I certainly enjoyed my time, and I don't regret any choices. Now, the nuance there is that I made a choice to be an officer before I made a choice to be a SEAL. So my path was set. There was no like resigning my commission and enlisting. That just wasn't an option for me. So I don't know. I made that choice before I made the other choice. So I guess maybe that's why it strikes me as a silly question, but there are people out there who legitimately haven't made either choice yet. So, they're wrestling with it. And it just sort of strikes me as, I don't know how to answer that for you.
Was your plan to do a career from the time you went in?
No, not necessarily. I kind of took it as, I'll see what the next 3 years are like. I'll see what the next 5 years are like. Then you kind of get to a tipping point where it's like, well, now you're just sort of a fool if you don't stay in. I did wrestle with getting out at about the 12-ish year mark. I think it was 12 or 13. I did toy around with it just because I'd run into some career snags. But ultimately, I mean, the conclusion I came to was, hey, I still like what I do. I still get to hang out, with this community that I love, and that's okay. And if promotion doesn't come, I'm good with it. I get to do some fun stuff. So, and be in the job that I love. So why not? I didn't, and there wasn't, I mean, I dabbled a little bit in like what else was out there. And I really didn't, nothing grabbed me. Nothing was like, oh, I would have had to have a compelling reason, and I didn't. So I stayed in for the long haul. I think I probably made that decision at about the 13-year mark, like, because at that point you're like, well, let's see how the next 5 years go. At that point, you're really making the decision to stay in for the 20. So that's what I did.
Were you a West Coast team guy the whole time?
East Coast for most of it. And then right about at that inflection point that I just described, I went over to Team 5 on the West Coast, and I finished out my career there. Well, on the West Coast.
Did you start on the East Coast by choice or by order?
Yeah. No, I did. I wanted, at the time we could choose East or West Coast was basically or SDV. And we got our orders at the end of BUDS. I think we were still in third phase when we got our orders. Nowadays, I think they do it much later. And you literally just put on a sheet of paper, East Coast, West Coast, SDV, and they pretty much divided the class. I think if you wanted SDV, you pretty much got it at the time. And they just divided the class between the East and West Coast. And generally speaking, everybody went to the same team from the class. So for me, it was 7 and 10. And so all the East Coast guys went to 10. That's where I ended up. And it was great. I don't know what, maybe just being kind of an East Coast guy. I don't know that I really had an opinion on if there was a difference between the coasts. I don't know that I knew enough about it to really know the answer there, but I knew I liked Virginia, and I was like, East Coast, be closer to my folks, and my sister and everybody lives on the East Coast, so I'll go to the East Coast.
You made it to just over 20 years?
Yeah, like 20 and change. I think I was at 20 and 8 months or something like that.
At the 20-year mark, was there any consideration going to 30?
No. No, I'm not Admiral material. It never was. And I mean, I suppose if my career was on that trajectory, maybe, but I don't, no, there was no, in fact, I don't think would have been able to serve past about 26, I think would have been the max that I could have done. And there were really no more jobs that excited me that were down the road. So it was time.
Do you have anything lined up?
No.
No plans? I'm just going to get out and wing it?
No, it wasn't quite like that. I did start thinking seriously about, okay, well, I got to do something. And really what popped into my head more than anything, which is bizarre, is, I've got to make money. I had to figure out how to do that. I've never had to figure out how to do that. I've always had a job. And I've never even really given much thought to the money coming in. I mean, it was fine. I was able to live the lifestyle I wanted to live. It was more than enough. It's never been a concern of mine. And now I'm 43 years old, and at the time, and well, shit, gotta make some money. I at least want to replace what was there, right? So that became sort of a very...
What is the grind? It's not just a routine, but the decision we make to wake up, give everything we've got, then find a way to go further. Grind, spelt GRND, is more than a brand. It's a movement, an emotion we all feel connected to as we work daily to pursue our goals and support each other. Founded by a former Army Ranger, Grind Activewear has a clear mission: to give 100% and then some more. In sport, fitness, and in life. Functional, high-quality performance wear that's rooted in American culture. Because you demand gear that outworks the rest. Whether you're on the field, in the gym, or building your own lane, Grind is for those who refuse to settle. Go check out the Grind Collective. That's the grndcollective.com and tap into something bigger than clothing. And while you're there, use the promo code TRANSITION15 to get 15% off your purchase.
Breaking kind of some rules in finding another career, I knew that I would want to do something that I would want to do, that I was going to be passionate about, it wasn't going to just grind me down, and I'd hate going in every day, but the pay was good. I knew that wasn't going to work. But that was what I was told. Everyone, who I would ask, or even any of the like the transition programs that I did, they were all very sort of focused on purpose, and you can have your dream job now. And I'm like,
what's my dream job?
I had my dream job. And I started to resent it a little bit. I started to resent the process of getting out, because I was like, don't tell me I can have my dream job. I worked really hard to get my dream job. And now I'm having to I'm having to kill that now. This is not about I can have my dream job. This is about how do I survive the next 40 years of my life, potentially, doing something that doesn't drive me absolutely insane, right? And also I've got to make money. That was this constant sort of thing in the back of my mind. And so the path I've always liked boats, which makes sense. And because of my experience in the Navy, I was pretty close to my 100-ton captain's license with the Coast Guard. So I took a class. I was still on active duty when I took it. And I was able to complete the various requisite things for my 100-ton license. So I got that. And the idea was I was gonna go into the yachting industry, mostly captaining. And if I could get into brokerage too, that would be cool, because, you sell one boat and that's a nice paycheck. You sell 2 or 3, that's phenomenal. I didn't know anything about really the maritime industry, and specifically like luxury boats, nothing. So I did some kind of cold call type research, and I kind of linked up with some people who knew, and I started to dig into it. And as I learned more, I thought, you know what? The military uses privately owned vessels for training when they don't want to look overtly military. Specifically, Naval Special Warfare does this. I was like, well, maybe I could create this thing where it was like a network of vessels and vessel owners who are kind of on like, hey, SEALs want to train on your boat. Would that be cool? And, surprisingly, a lot of people are like, yeah, because for one, rich people who own boats also tend to be conservative, tend to be
pro-military
fans of the military. So it's not a hard sell. And then also their boat's making them money while it's not being used. So, that's always appealing. So I thought, this could be a possibility. And there were a couple guys doing this sort of thing. And so I got linked up with them and created an LLC for myself. And the problem though is that these contracts that and how it all works is there's prime contractors, the big names out there, and then they subcontract for things like this, like a privately owned vessel for some specific part of the exercise. So I had to come in as like a subcontractor underneath the prime. Well, if the prime doesn't win, then neither do I. So I found myself putting together these proposals that basically never went anywhere because the prime wouldn't win. And then as I did it more and more, it started to just become kind of shady to me. And what I found out was that really what was going on, there was a lot of like the prime would talk to this subcontractor and then this subcontractor, and then they would get the pricing and they'd say, hey, can you come down a little bit? Okay, good. Can you come down a little bit? And they're not legally allowed to talk about the actual price, but they can kind of hint towards it. And it started to become, wait a second. Me and this other guy who are both trying to do the same thing, we're now being pitted against each other. And by the way, I know that guy. He's a friend. So we talk. So we're going to figure this out. And it became, I really don't want any part of this. So I was able to win 1 or 2 contracts. I did that last summer sometime, and it was okay. And at that point I was like, I can't keep doing this. This is the type of thing where you could make $150K a year or 0. And it wasn't really up to me. Didn't matter how good my proposals were or anything like that. So I'm like, I don't love this. And right about the time I kind of hung up the hat with that is when the coaching job came about. And, I had been rowing with the club. A former teammate of mine from Navy had kind of dragged me back into it. And I was like, nah. And I had this thing about rowing clubs where I was like, I rowed in a fast crew. I know the commitment level it took to get there. I know how the hard work involved in getting a crew to that level. And I got there. There's no way a rowing club is, so I became kind of elitist about it, I guess. And I felt that way for many years. And then finally he's like, dude, you got to come out. He's like, I'm rowing with. I'm like, no. And this was right after I retired, you know, and he's like, seriously, come out. And he kept bugging me about it. And I finally was like, you know what? Fine. Okay. I'll humor you. By the way, that ain't shit I'm doing right now. I kind of have no excuse to not go for 2 hours and at least get a workout in, you know, there's no excuse. So I sort of shamed myself into coming on, and I went along and I got in the boat and I was like, oh my God, I remember this. This is incredible.
So you had not continued rowing during your career?
I rowed in like 2 or 3 alumni races at the Charles. Just group of guys, you know, like you're not training together. I would get myself as fit as I could. We'd all show up in Boston, hop in the boat and go down the river. And it was fun, you know, an alumni thing, but never trained. I really pretty much hung up the oar. And I got back in this boat and I started rowing, and, you know, come to find out there's former Olympians at the club. You know, wherever my elitist attitude came from, it quickly dissolved. And I was like, well, this is actually pretty fun. So I got into it, and I started going with some regularity. And then I started doing things like volunteering. Like I would volunteer to drive the trailer with the boats. So my wife would joke that I became a part-time truck driver. It's true. And I drove, you know, a little bit of that. But it was a volunteer thing. You know, I'd be like, yeah, I'll do it. And I would pretty much do it because I had the time. And, you know, all these guys they're rowing, they have jobs. And I'm kind of like the guy who doesn't have a job. So I built kind of a reputation for myself within the club, which was, I think, was positive. And so when the offer came for the head coach for the junior men's program, you know, it's the high schoolers, he moved up to college. He coaches at UCSD now. So the position became available, and they kind of put it out on a group chat. And I thought to myself, I mean, the pay's not great, but I bet I'd get a lot out of that. I bet that seems like it would be something I'd really enjoy. So I applied, and they gave me the job, and it was, you know, my first impression, probably in the first week of being around these guys and being the coach, I'd watch them, and I'm like, they remind me of a platoon of SEALs. Just how they joke with each other. They all love a physical challenge. They're tough. They come to, you know, wanting, even if they're not that good at it, they still try hard and put everything. And I don't know. They just reminded me of team guys a little bit, like just young team guys. And so it was an easy fit in that sense. And, you know, and then rowing, you know, I mean, I love the sport. So it's fun to be around that. And then, you know, we went through the season, some setbacks, some high points. And then I ended up, kind of whittling it down, and we ended up qualifying a boat for the national championship. There's a regional qualifying race, because this is, you know, obviously nationwide. The regional qualifying race, I think you had to get top 3 or 4 there, and the boat got second. And then we had about 5 weeks to train for the national championship, and we went and we got second, a silver medal at the national championship by that much.
Wow.
It was a crazy finish. And out of nowhere, really. I mean, the crews that we were up against in that race were very serious programs. I mean, one kid in the boat that beat us, one of those guys went on to the U19 national team that competed last summer. So, you know, I mean, these are the best high school rowers in the nation, and we hung right in there. So it was very rewarding, and it was great to see, you know, how just the excitement and how proud of themselves those guys were, was really fun to be a part of that. So was your team ranked heading into that competition? They don't really do rankings, just because they do in college, because there's enough information in a small enough pool where they can generally rank. So you'll show up in college with a seeding. In high school, not really. There are regions that are faster than others. typically, but you never know. There's outliers. So what they do in the high school events is they row a time trial to start, and then that becomes your seeding. And then from time trial to semifinal to final. So you race 3 times over the course of about a week. And my guys finished, I think, 3rd in the time trial, so they were seeded up pretty high, and then 2nd in their semi, and then 2nd in the final. So they did great. It's really rewarding to be a part of that.
You guys run out of Mission Bay?
Yeah.
So I know I've seen the shacks and the boats out there, but competitions, Southern California or on the West Coast, are they also handled there, or where's the primary competition place?
It's kind of all over. The farthest we go is Sacramento. You
rowing on the Delta there?
Lake Natoma. It's a little inland from Sacramento. We sometimes go up to Newport. There's a couple of races in Newport. There's the San Diego Crew Classic, which is a pretty big event on Mission Bay. And just a sort of a handful of scrimmages here and there. There's really not, that's the thing about rowing is, it might be the most lopsided sport there is in terms of training versus competition. I added it up at the end of last season, and I think if I get the numbers right, I think I came up with something like a little over 1,000 hours and somewhere around 3 million meters, either on the water or on the ergometer, which is the indoor rowing machine, for 6.5 minutes of competition. This race takes about 6.5 minutes. College 8s are somewhere around 5.5, 5:40. But yeah, high school 8 or a 4 is somewhere between 6 minutes and 6.5 minutes. That's a lot of thankless work for not much competition, which honestly is one of the things I kind of like about the sport. Just sort of you work really hard and you get one shot, and I've always kind of liked that about it.
Definitely something to not having a quote unquote season like a football, baseball, basketball, where like, okay, it's just one loss.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
or you get to a point in the season where all you're doing is playing games, and maybe you'd go to a batting practice on Thursday, but mostly you're just playing games, and yeah, it's not like that at all. So
now, if I'm understanding correctly, though, you've moved on from the coaching.
Nope.
Or you're still doing that?
Still doing it. Yep.
Are you also doing other type coaching too?
Yeah. So I just recently got hired on I'm the civilian instructor for the junior officer training course, which is for SEAL officers who have just finished BUDS and they're not yet through the advanced training. So and I mentioned it earlier when I was in that course and the class was running. It's that course. And so I help instruct that, which is a lot of fun. That sort of youthful exuberance is still there. These guys come out of BUDS and they're not jaded yet. It's fun to be there kind of at the beginning of their journey and able to teach them some things that I've learned along the way. So it's very rewarding.
I asked this because, like I told you, in seeing you on the first podcast with Simon Sinek, and you're very true about that, walking out the last day, going from active military to now being a civilian. And I'd like you to talk about that and what that transition was like for you and how you dealt with it. But then also pivot into how is it helping you today to have that touch point back to the SEAL community?
Well, the transition was rough for me, and I think mostly just because it, I talked a little bit about this with Simon, but just the sense of loss of the community of this is really, at the end of the day, it's really what my identity was. And you feel like, you kind of need to kill that a little bit. And, which I know isn't the case, but you sort of, you got to be careful. There's a lot of people out there who, they want veterans to I see it like on LinkedIn and various platforms. I see there's all kinds of advice about how, veterans can assimilate better into civilian life. And I became sort of cynical about it through this process because, I'd hear, for example, a guy would get up in front of our like transition cohort and he'd be like, you guys got to stop with the acronyms, the military acronyms. You guys talking acronyms. And then he would get up and talk in
Acronyms.
a whole different set of acronyms. And I'd see this and I'd be like, I'm gonna ask. I'm sorry, but I don't know that acronym. What was it? What does that mean? And I would do that as sort of a snarky way of being like, dude, you're doing the same thing. It's a human thing. We all will shorten long titles or whatever into acronyms. This is just the military does it. Everyone does it. So I'm not different because I dealt with acronyms for my entire adult life. So don't treat me that way. And then there were other things about the whole, you could have your dream job. And I'm like, how dare you a little bit? Like, I had my dream job. What makes your job something I want? I really felt that way. And I don't know if that was the right, I think that it was probably me revolting against it a little bit. But it also just seemed like, I was being sold on something that I really wanted, but I didn't. And I wasn't convinced that, life in the corporate world was better or something that was even desirable for me. So it was hard. And I it's a time in my life I refer to now as the wallowing, where I just, I drank a lot. Part of that was out of boredom. Part of that was out of numbing. I wasn't the best to be there for my family. I was there, I took them to school in the morning. I was there and, I was there, but I wasn't there. And it was really, I knew that I felt like I was circling the drain. I really felt that way. And I got to a point where I was like, I'm killing myself. I mean, I'm not at a point where I'm holding a gun to my head, but I'm killing myself. And I've got to figure something out. I've got to, what tools do I have that I can pull myself out of this, Now, there's something I didn't talk to Simon about. I had a lot of friends whose opinions I trusted and who were good friends. And they talked very highly of the like a psychedelic retreat. And I was like, no, it's not for me. I don't do drugs. And maybe it was a little bit of judgment there, maybe. But these were guys whose opinions I really trusted. And they were being honest with me, and we were having conversations like this where it was like, yeah. And I knew that they understood what this felt like. And they were like, it's incredible. It gives you your life back. And so I agreed. I went through a program called V.E.T.S with Marcus Capone and his wife. And they were kind enough to give me a grant. And I came out of pocket for about 50% of it. And I signed up September 11th. I went to Mexico. This would have been last year, almost a year ago. And I told my wife in the car, she dropped me off down in San Diego at the hotel for the ride down there. And I sat there in the car for a bit and I was like, I don't want to do this. And she's like, well, you're in it now. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't want to do this. And I think I was, first off, it was a big leap for me. And secondly, I was honestly afraid of what I was going to learn about myself. And so I went down there and I went through it, and I can't, I mean, it was incredible how I felt afterwards. And I won't get into all the detail because some of it's very personal, but the last sort of image that I saw was, it was like I was laying down on the ground in like a large warehouse, and there was this pallet of bricks suspended from the ceiling. And I remember just sort of looking at it, and then it, for no reason, it fell, and just like exactly that, a pallet of bricks falling onto the ground. And that was sort of the last image that I saw. And it occurred to me really in the moment that I was like, that's it. That's the weight dropping. That's my brain letting go. And when that, that happened, and that process, I went through that, and I came out, everything was different. Everything was different. The air felt crisper. I felt like I remembered feeling, graduating from the Naval Academy and driving across country to go, like, just sort of this sense of what amazing things could be ahead of me now. And I think, I actually found out when I was in Mexico that I got the job for the rowing. I had an email came through, and I saw that. And so, like, fortunate the timing, right? And I showed up, to the boathouse, a few days later, just with a new energy and a new, kind of purpose. And so I say all that to say, and this is where I would give advice, because I don't know that that's the right answer for everybody. The advice that I would give is, it might be helpful to reach back into your past and figure out what gave you purpose at some point in your life. What did you love? And for me, the rowing, it sounds sort of weird and hokey, but, I pursued a career in the SEAL teams for the same reason that I rowed. That's the kind of, I wanted to be in a committed team that loved to work hard, that joked around with each other, that fought like lions when it was time to compete. That's who I wanted to be with. And that was, that's why I knew, like, I needed to get myself to Buds, because I needed to be with those people. And I knew enough about the community to know that that's where that existed. And I think that, while I resisted it at first, my buddy bringing me back to that, as simple as it sounds, and, I think turned on some things in my brain that were, that's the loss I was mourning, and I was missing that from my life. And now I'm able to, to show up and to, and to function. The wallowing that was a long time. Wow, it was a year ago or a year and a half ago, but I'm thankful to have come out of that, because it was dark for a while. And I don't know that my family really knew, honestly. I kind of kept it to myself. Obviously my wife could see the signs, and I'm not sure she knew how to approach it, because on the surface, everything was fine. It was all held together. But I think she could tell. But I kept a lot of it to myself. And it's that, I think you just have to be willing to accept, accept the help. I think that's the answer.
Now that you've been through that process and you have the ability to look back, what advice would you give for offloading the trauma,
finding that purpose? And it doesn't have to look exactly like, what you did in the service. It could be something completely different, but if it stimulates the same things, then that works. That's it. One of my favorite, honestly, it's the reason why I open up LinkedIn these days, is for a guy named Michael Clemmer. I don't know this guy. I've never met him. He sells Ariel Resupply coffee. Familiar?
Mm-hmm.
And his posts are just like satirical, like bashings of himself, the military, other people who post about leadership. I mean, all these things. And he just, nobody's safe with him. And I read these things and I think to myself, here's a guy who figured it out. This is, purposeful for him. He feels like he's got something, and he's selling coffee, so it doesn't really matter what, but it does matter why. And, I'm fortunate enough now to be in kind of two parallel positions where I get to do what means a lot to me, which is, mentor and develop these young guys, whether it's in rowing or growing up to be competent SEAL officers, which is something I am very passionate about. So I'm very lucky at this point to have those things.
On the daily, is there anything that you've adopted for your personal benefit that you do now each day since coming out of the treatment in Mexico?
I row. Yeah. And there's sort of peak moments throughout the year that are kind of sort of competitions to lead up to. What I'm working on now is the head of the Charles is in mid to late October. And we've got a boat of guys who are all Navy alums. Some I've rowed with. Actually, I think I've rowed with all of them at this point before. Some while I was there, some since. And we send each other training plans and kind of keep tabs on, and it's good. There's some accountability there, and you train for it. We unfortunately, we're all over the U.S., so we've got to kind of train individually, and we won't come together as a crew until we see each other in Boston. But it's something to work towards, and it gives. I mean, I was never one of those guys who could just get up and work out for the sake of working out. There are people who do that, and I've got a lot of respect for that. I don't have that. I'll do it.
There's got to be a perceived purpose behind it.
To me, there's got to be something I'm working towards, and it can't be like, I'm going to lose 5 pounds. That's what I'm working towards. No, it's got to be like a competition I'm working towards. I've noticed anyways, that's what will get me doing it. And that same guy who brought me out to San Diego Rowing Club, he and I row together pretty regularly. And that's a lot of fun. I mean, it really, it sounds kind of crappy because I've got to get up at about 4:15 to make it there. The practices are from 5 to 7 in the mornings. And that's really for a couple of reasons. One, the water, Mission Bay becomes this wakeboarding nightmare by about 7 a.m. But also because, people work. So, it's around their work schedule, and it's sort of a rowing cultural thing to do it that early. So I get myself up to go do that. And honestly, it's not hard to get up to do that. It's, there's some, out there on the bay as the sun's coming up, it's really kind of it's a cool time. I think because a lot of people won't do it, and you can be out there. That's kind of always been, something that's sort of motivated me is, hey, I'm doing something that not everybody can do, or not everybody wants to do. And that's always been sort of I guess, motivating for me. So,
in an odd way, though, isn't that the essence of making it through SEAL training? Everybody's going through the difficult thing. It's just, are you willing to get up and do it again and then come back and do it tomorrow?
Well, yeah. I mean, individually, everyone's kind of in their own head. But I think, I think rowers typically have a pretty good track record at BUD/S because, you've got to deal with both things, right? You've got to deal individually with your own sort of discomfort, but then you also are there because of a team. And, the guys, I don't know. I've always kind of mused over why people quit, but I think that there's probably a slew of reasons, but I think there are some commonalities. And one of those commonalities might be that they don't really buy into the idea that they're a part of a team. And so they don't feel that responsibility to like, hey, I've got to show up because there's 5 or 6 other guys who are counting on me to show up. I don't know that they really buy into that concept when they're like, you're sort of deep in first phase and the individual discomfort is sort of insurmountable for a lot of people. And they just kind of like, well, I'm cold, I'm tired, I'm wet and sandy, but all it takes is to look around and be like,
so is everybody else.
So is everybody else. And I never had a hard time finding that in BUD/S. And I think it's because I rode. I never, anytime I sort of went into my head of like, oh, fuck, I'm cold right now. The guy next to me was shivering too. And it was kind of like, you just sort of shiver a little closer. I remember we had this one kid in my BUD/S class, such a great guy. He was a running back for Ohio State. I think he may have been like a 3rd or 4th string running back for Ohio State. 0 body fat, 0. And when we'd line up for the surf torture, he'd run down the line, Gordo, where you at, man? I'd be like, I'm over here, Aaron. And he'd come running. By the end of it, he'd be like clamped onto me. And he's like, I don't know what it is about you, man, but the water around you is warm. I said, well, sometimes I pee. He's like, I don't care.
It's just warmer.
So, you show up for someone else and it makes it a little bit more tolerable. You show up for a lot of other people and it makes it even more tolerable. I can't, when I was rowing, I couldn't fathom. I remember sleeping through a practice once. And I mean, sleep deprivation is kind of part of being a plebe. And I was my plebe year and I slept through a practice. I was like a Saturday morning practice and I slept through it. And I woke up probably like 30 minutes after I needed to be there. And I was like, just this pit, bottom of my stomach. And I sprinted over to the boathouse. And by the time I got there, all the boats had left. And I just felt, I mean, it was the worst feeling. And, I even like punished myself on I did a workout and then when they started coming back, an hour or so later or whatever, I wanted to like be like, I did something while you guys are gone. And I just felt this, this intense feeling of like letting them down. And I never wanted to feel that again, but that's what the sport does to you. And that was bred into me, through that sport. And so the idea of quitting BUD/S just, it got hard, sure. But the idea of ringing the bell, I don't know that ever truly occurred to me. There were times I didn't want to do it anymore, for sure. But honestly contemplating quitting and giving up a career in the SEAL teams, I don't know that I ever truly considered that. If I ever did, it was back in the process of when I was on the ship and sort of feeling around in the dark for, okay, who do I talk to? Who do I send the package to? What needs to be in the package? Like all these things for which there was no roadmap. If I ever considered quitting, that was it. Because there were times when I was like, you know what? This does seem like it's too hard. And there's no guarantee I'm going to get picked to go. And I could spend, the next 2 years and not get it. And then like I'm screwing myself in another career. So if there was ever a time, it was then. But once I was there, I was like, oh, no, we're here now.
Back then, do you think there was a method to the madness in that it was almost part of the testing process to see who really wanted it?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question because, and I've heard some older SEALs kind of complaining about this now, is that the community is sort of leaning towards this almost like we're catering to people to come into the community, as opposed to, 20 or 30 years ago when it was like, yeah, we're the SEAL teams. Just come find us. If you're meant to be here, you'll be here. So you'd get kids who like from Oklahoma who had never seen the ocean before, scared shitless, showing up and being like, well, I just know I know not to quit. And then, they become team guys, And now it's like, they get separated out in boot camp, the officers, there's that program I talked about. And it's not unreasonable to imagine that guys coming into the program now feel like, like I was recruited to be here, sort of, and I mean, we deal with it, but I think that a lot of some of the more senior SEALs feel that, like that there's a little bit of a mindset shift in the guys coming through, maybe. And I don't want to condemn, the people who are going through it now. It's not across the board.
You can only go through at the time that you came in.
You can only do that. Yeah. I mean, right. We cannot pick our time in history. But I guess my caution would be, let's not make it seem like we want them too badly. Like, we do want people to show up who want to be there and have a deep desire to not quit and not let down their team. Like, that's who we're looking for. I don't really care how many push-ups and pull-ups you can do. Well, I guess we do to some standard, but like, what we really want to know is that you're going to be there on the last day of Hell Week with a smile on your face, ready for more. Like, that's the guy we want. I don't know. That's a very internal. You have to have your heart straight for that. I mean, I look for the same sort of qualities when I select a boat. The guys whose hearts are there. I can't coach heart. No, you can't. It's got to come from them. And I always joke, rowing's that one sport you can't do against your will. And I think it was there's a very esteemed coach in the community, a guy named Steve Gladstone, who coached at California, he coached at Yale, coached at Navy last year. And I think the quote from him was, "This is a sport that requires passion, not mild interest." And you could say the same thing about buds and becoming a SEAL.
Stupid question about rowing. Does the seat you're in dictate the type of training you might do independently?
No, not really. There is some strategy to boating. If you want a certain guy following another guy, down in the stern of the boat is usually the guys they're usually the better. Not necessarily better, but they have very predictable rhythm because that's who everyone's following. If you're kind of in the middle of the boat, you can sort of get away with a little bit more raw technique, but power is really, you can get away with just kind of cranking on it. And then the guys up in the bow have to have some pretty slick technique because that's where a lot of the set in the boat comes from. So there is some strategy to it. You don't necessarily want your biggest, heaviest, strongest guys up in the bow because
weight.
There's something to it, but no, I mean, across the boat, the training is the same.
The little bit that I've seen, the one that looks insane is the one where they kneel on the boat and it's the single rower.
Oh yeah,
that just looks like
it's a completely different sport.
Oh wow,
completely different. We're the only ones who don't look where we're going.
The evolution of the way the teams are. You'll hear it repeatedly. There's nothing secretive about the process anymore in totality.
Right.
And it hasn't increased the number of people that are making it through. And
No, it doesn't seem to have.
but from what you're seeing now with the drawdown and obviously less kinetic activity, are there less people coming to the door knocking saying, I want to be a SEAL? Are you seeing that?
I know that in the last couple years, recruiting numbers were down across the military, and the SEAL numbers were no exception. But that has since rebounded, as I understand. And you see the same number of candidates coming in, and roughly the same attrition. And it's all basically the same thing. I mean, yeah, there's probably little differences, and anybody with some salt will try to, say that, well, we had to do it this way, and that and everything
Back
else.
in my day.
Yeah. But I mean, it's still hard. I'll tell you this right now. I'm 45. I don't want to go through buds. Nope. You only have to go through once. I'm good with my one shot. I wouldn't want to do it right now. I mean, I watch these guys. I mean, I've worked down there. I watch these guys on the beach every day. I'm like, whoa. I remember it was yesterday or the day before. It was the day before. And I see probably 12 guys line up, and there's an instructor. And I can't hear, the window's closed. I can't hear what's going on, but I can watch them, and they run probably, 20, 30 yards down the beach around a little ammo can and come back. And then the top 3 guys who finished, they get to go away. And then the next group, they line up again. And I thought to myself, pays to be a runner. You always hear pays to be a winner. And I'm sure that that's what that instructor said. Hey, it's pays to be a winner on this one. And so you could let the first 3 guys go. Nope, pays to be a runner. Because win or lose, you will be running. That is the fact. So.
A lot. Well, I've heard him talk about how there's so much ancillary running that doesn't even get factored into the run. The run from wherever you're training at to chow. The run,
back.
It's like it's all the added stuff that doesn't get quote unquote measured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of extra.
I like to close out with any last pieces of advice, but I want to specifically hit on something that you said in that interview with Simon that really just hammered it home. And you described it as the loudest noise or the loudest sound you heard in your career. And it's on that last day, the door closing behind you.
Yeah.
And then you added to the fact, especially if you have to get somebody to let you out that door.
Yeah.
Going along those lines, any last pieces of advice for somebody transitioning out?
I mean, I probably would have been better to recognize that I wasn't alone. And I think on one level I must have known that. I mean, obviously I had to have known that. But to keep so much of it to myself of what was really painful, I don't think that's helpful for anybody. I think the more open and honest conversations that you can have with, and it doesn't matter who it is really. I mean, it could be a spouse, it could be, your teammates, it could be some mentor, whatever. Someone who's willing to listen. I think that it's important. I think it's really important to just, and it doesn't have to be this well-articulated thought of, I have reflected on how I'm feeling. This is what I've come up with. It doesn't have to be that. It can be raw. It can be emotional. It can be tears, whatever. But I think it's important to really address that, and don't slip into the bottle. I use that metaphorically. Don't look for ways to numb. look for ways to confront. And I mean, the answer is going to be different for everyone. If there was one answer, it'd be easy. And it's sort of everyone's journey, but, I think, what I've ended up doing and what I've landed on, I think follows with how I've lived and the things that I've found passion in. And so that makes sense, that maybe there could be some other completely different thing that's out there that would be available, but I guarantee you whatever that is, it looks a lot like what I'm doing now. So, and I knew this when I got out. I knew that, just in the back of my mind, I knew it would end up looking like this: teaching, coaching, something, some sort of similar type thing. I never imagined it would be coaching crew. Personally, I thought I would never had a shot at a job like that, honestly, because I don't really have a great rowing resume. I was never an Olympian. I was never even a national team member. I didn't win a national championship. A lot of those guys, I mean, you look at rowing coaches around the country, even at the high school level, some of these guys are pretty experienced and pretty accomplished. And I haven't really done much. Yeah, our boat was fast once, but so I really kind of, if that thought ever popped into my head, I'd really kind of written it off, because I was like, I would never get picked for a job like that. But it came my way, and I'm grateful for it.
I think that says something, though, that's important about when you get the opportunity to teach, coach, lead, is one, to not undersell yourself if you weren't quote unquote the superstar, because how many NFL Super Bowl winning quarterbacks are head coaches in the NFL?
I don't know.
But the other thing I think that's important is that if you weren't that superstar, there's a different level of grit. There's a different level of commitment that you had, that you understand when the lowest guy is struggling, that maybe if you had been that superstar, that where everything, I don't want to say everything came easy, right, but it was easier for you. You can't relate to that guy who was struggling to be the number 8 guy in the boat.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I've often thought that over the arc of my rowing career at Navy, we started out, we were not fast. We struggled. And then as I got, towards the end of my time, my junior year and my senior year, we got fast. We were in the conversation at that point. And to go from back of the pack to up with, I remember the day we were doing just 500 meter, I don't know, 8 or 10 of them in the creek right next to the boathouse at Navy. They had a little 500 meter stretch. And we'd do just sort of a time trial type thing. And back then we didn't have the GPS, measure. It was just my coach, kind of like old school, like horse around the track type thing. And he clocked us at 500 meters after, I think, our 8th or 9th one. And he said, well, fellas, I think we can stop talking about Harvard and Yale and start talking about California and Washington now. And we were like, what? Like, what was our time? That was fun. That was really fun, getting fast. But going from slow to fast and being able to reflect on what changed, what was the difference? Because it was mostly the same guys. I mean, yeah, some guys had graduated on and new guys had come in, but for the most part, it was the same-ish 4 to 5 guys who were kind of the core of that. So what changed? Did we suddenly figure out how to row? I don't know that our technique changed that much. Did we get more powerful? Well, maybe. I mean, I got fitter over 4 years, but something else changed. Not enough to make up that kind of speed. So I've always been really curious about that in my own experience. And then how do I harness whatever that was and give it to these young guys who, finishing the way we finished last year was not, I don't know that anybody really expected that. We've always been okay as a club, but never there. And it was the same guys. I mean, there was one guy in that boat who the previous year in the same event, they won the sea level final. So they were 17th. And then that guy in the boat this year finished second. Did he have really better athletes around him? I don't think so. Maybe, but I don't think that was it. I think it was something else. And so it's fun to try to figure out kind of what that sort of magic ingredient is to and it's something. It's a synergy that you can't coach it. I mean, you can, I guess. You can encourage it. I don't know. Coaching rowing is just leadership, honestly. It's not, there's no trick plays. There's no strategy. There's no, I guess there's strategy, but there's no like, all right, we're going to fake the punt on this one. None of that. It's like, and as soon as the boat launches, my job's over. I'm like the director of a movie. Like, I have nothing to do once it's in production. My job's over. So, these guys launch and they go row and they've got only how you've been able to kind of lead them. And so that's kind of how I look at it. But
I can't relate it to rowing. I've never been, but something that I think you and I can both relate to is a team moving through a house or a building. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've experienced it where you put 6, 8, 10 guys, whatever, they don't work smoothly together, but you keep that team together, mm-hmm. or you find the right 6 or 8 guys for whatever reason. It's not spoken. It's just, they move through a location better. And not that anybody's keeping a stopwatch on it, but all of a sudden they start moving through efficiently much faster than another team.
Yeah.
It's just something I think that the cogs in the wheel just kind of get into line at some point. Mm-hmm. And if you've got the right people, you can work magic together.
Yeah, it really is. And I remember at Navy there was a couple guys who ended up quitting the team, and we would get faster. And it's not that they weren't good rowers. I think it has a lot to do with that other thing that makes teams work, which is fascinating to me. That's always been a fascinating thing. How did my chief turn those 7 or 8 new guys into a really high performing team? How do you do that? There's something else. It's not just skill. And some of them weren't even that skilled, to be honest. Well, I hope they don't hear this. No, they were great. But it was more about how they were with each other. Mm-hmm. It was more about even the stuff that was outside of operational bounds, even just kind of how they hung out together. That plays a factor as well. Anyway, it's a fascinating thing, and I really enjoy being a student of it, and that's kind of what I get to do now. So it's enjoyable.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your story. Thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best going forward.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
As always, thank you for listening or watching the episode. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to reach out on social media or send me an email. The links are all in the show notes. I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you're not already, please follow the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe on YouTube. And if you would, please leave me a rating. Ratings do 2 things. You can tell me what I need to fix or improve, and the more ratings also gets the podcast recommended to more people. Another ask, please share the podcast with anyone you think could benefit from and enjoy it. And last, don't forget, sign up for the newsletter.